Hello, good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are located, and welcome to this webinar from Simply Stakeholders. We've got a few people still logging in, so we'll just give them a minute to finish logging in. But while we do, perhaps you could introduce yourself. Let us know in the chat where you're calling from and just a little bit about yourself, maybe. It's always good for the other participants if they know who else is on the call. And we tend to get people calling in from all around the world on our webinars, which is pretty nice for us. So yeah, say hello. I'm going to ask you to use a chat function later, so please get familiar with it. Hey, Drew, calling in from Canada, from Vancouver and South Africa. Welcome. It's always more interesting for the webinar if people participate. So throughout the session today, I'm going to pause every now and then and ask you some questions. So it'd be great to get your participation. Tifali from Pakistan, welcome. Antoinette, now that's a name that's familiar. Nice to see you. Well, I can't see you, but nice to see your name again. Brilliant. Jamie from Texas. Okay, well, I think we'll get started because all of you are on time and I want to make the best use of your time. Carol from Florida, welcome. Likewise, Antoinette. Brilliant. Okay, we're going to get started. My name is Alison Hendricks. I'm the founder of Simply Stakeholders, and Darzen is our company originally. I used to work in stakeholder engagement for a number of years, running stakeholder engagement processes for large infrastructure projects, advising government and businesses around the world. And it was really my own frustration of not having better tools to manage the data that led me down this path of starting this company. That was quite a few years ago. A lot has changed since then. The product has evolved a lot. But today I still really love working with people around the world, helping them with their stakeholder engagement. My team loves it too. We now have customers right across the world. Today I'm calling in from Denver in the United States. So great to be here and enjoying the cold weather, the snow. So one of the reasons for hosting this webinar on this topic of stakeholder analysis is really, that I find that is often the missing piece in the puzzle for a lot of organizations who are doing stakeholder engagement. And yet it's so critical. It forms a foundation of good and effective stakeholder engagement or stakeholder management, public participation, whatever term you use for this type of work that we do. And so I wanted to share with you what our thinking is on stakeholder management, stakeholder analysis, how we've been approaching it with our software tools. I'm also going to give you a little preview of where we're going next with it. So although what we have now today is really quite advanced, a lot more than what most organizations are doing in the space of stakeholder analysis, we're taking it to another step. So you'll be one of the first to get a preview of what's coming in the platform. We have a new version coming out in just over a month's time, so I'm going to give you a little preview of that as well. Excuse me. So in today's session, we're going to just start off by looking at what is stakeholder analysis. We're going to look at what are some of the benefits, why is it important, how you can use it to your advantage. We're then going to take a deep dive into how you can actually do it. How do you go about analysing your stakeholders, and I'll share with you the details of our approach that we take with it. Hope that's okay for all of you. Please feel free to add comments or questions in the chat, and I will try and get to them all as we go through. Brilliant. So what is stakeholder analysis? Really what we're talking about here is the process of understanding your stakeholders, knowing, starting off with, sorry, I need to put my glasses back on. Looking at, let's start off by first considering who are the stakeholders. So these would be any people, organizations, or groups that are involved in or impacted by your work or your project. Common examples would be employees, customers, government bodies, members of the public, businesses, regulatory bodies, right? So it's a very broad, all-encompassing term when we talk about stakeholders. It could even be shareholders, right? It's a term that's getting more used and I think more commonly understood by businesses. So then when we look at what do we mean when we talk about stakeholder analysis, we're really talking about identifying who those stakeholders are, who should be involved in your process, working to understand what their needs are and requirements, what their interest in your work is, and how they can affect it, how you impact them and how they can impact you and your work. And creating some groups and some plans, action plans based on this understanding that the analysis gives you. Okay, so starting with that definition in mind then, when we get into, this is a little picture just saying some of the different types of groups or people that would be considered stakeholders. Sometimes you may be running just an internal engagement process and your stakeholders are all internal and you're trying to understand who are the various parties that, hold perhaps different types of expertise or different relationships with external parties. Most often, though, for our clients, it is a mixture of internal and external stakeholders. The process of analysis is relevant no matter what type of stakeholders you're dealing with. So how do you actually, what are the benefits? Why should you think about stakeholder analysis and how can you use it to your advantage? I think primarily the biggest requirement you need here is making sure you've identified all of the relevant stakeholders right from the start of your process or project, that there's no missing voices. We've seen some recent examples of how that can go catastrophically wrong if you actually miss someone in your engagement. So you could run a brilliant process that's all-encompassing, but a failure at this point of identifying the right stakeholders can really derail your entire project. So one of the examples I'm thinking of is an LNG project offshore, just off the coast of Australia, a really big project, ran a very long, detailed stakeholder engagement process, but the project was actually challenged in court and was put on hold. Their license got sort of paused or revoked based on the fact that they'd missed talking to a group of islanders, and one of the islands not far away from where their project was. They didn't think they had a requirement to include those stakeholders, and they'd missed the fact that those stakeholders had a cultural interest in those waterways and should have been engaged. So, a really sort of big problem later on. So despite having run this very detailed process, having missed an important group of stakeholders proved to, be a very expensive mistake for that company. So I think, that primarily is really important, and making sure there are no missing voices, that you have considered all of the people who should and need to be involved in your processes. I think another really big benefit is being more strategic, knowing who needs what and when. Antoinette just asked, is there a case study? Antoinette, I think I wrote a blog post on that just recently on our website. Someone might be able to help you find that, but have a look on our website. The blog post was really focused on this idea of interest, and I'll come to the concept of interest in a project later on in the session today. So a second really important benefit of stakeholder analysis is that it helps you just be more strategic. Knowing who to contact and when is really important as well. Too often we tend to do stakeholder engagement in a bit of a scattergun approach, where we just think if we just send out information or we invite everyone, we'll hopefully reach all of the people that we need to reach, and get them involved. And that's kind of not only time and resource intensive, it's not guaranteed to reach the right people. So not only is it inefficient, it just kind of is not strategic, right? So big efficiency gain in doing this analysis upfront. I think doing a robust analysis also sets a framework for future evaluation of your processes and outcome. How do you know if the engagement you're doing is going to be successful or making a difference to the outcomes that you're hoping to achieve? Without a good framework for this analysis, it's really hard to then do effective evaluation down the track. And I think it also creates confidence in your process, both internally within your own organization, giving your colleagues and your bosses confidence that you've got a good process and a good plan in place, but also externally. So not only with the stakeholders, but with the regulatory bodies, for example. Perhaps you've got to apply for permits for your project or your work. How do you give them confidence that you've actually done a really robust stakeholder engagement process? And if you are able to demonstrate a good set of analysis and how you approach it, I think that goes a long way to developing that confidence. So some of the key benefits or uses of the stakeholder analysis, obviously creating a really good stakeholder management plan, so exactly what you're going to do. It also helps you identify who your supporters and advocates are, and as well as on the other side of that equation, who is most opposed to your project or going to be the biggest challenge for you to engage with. I think understanding stakeholder networks is often missed. So not only understanding who could be a potential supporter or advocate for your work, but understanding how you can get to those hard to reach groups. So every stakeholder engagement process has some groups that are quite hard to engage with. Okay, but for various reasons, maybe it's language or just access to those communities. They're quite closed communities. How do you get to those people? So I think by going through the process of formally identifying your stakeholders and doing that analysis, you can actually understand if there are ways to get to those communities. How do you leverage the networks your stakeholders have themselves? Building trust and social license, really critical. So how do you, I think it's a key part of creating long-term trust and social license to operate is by being able to demonstrate to those communities and stakeholders that you're engaging with that you do have a robust plan in place. Your interactions can be more productive as well. You're going into your interactions understanding exactly what your objective is with certain stakeholders or stakeholder groups, and what information do you need to meet those objectives. Comes back to that idea of being more strategic with your approach. And finally, project enablement. Good stakeholder engagement can make your project, bad stakeholder engagement can break your project, right? So what do you need to do to ensure that your project meets its milestones and progresses as expected along the way? So there's some of the sort of key benefits or uses of that stakeholder analysis. So I'm going to pause you now and ask you to fill in a poll that should appear on your screen in your menu. I think on the right, it's on the right for me. I'm curious to know how you currently do stakeholder analysis. Right, we've got a few fairly advanced. That's awesome. Love to get your feedback then on some of the approaches we're taking. Okay, a few just getting started, some extensive, fantastic. Great. We've got quite a mix here. Give you a few more seconds if anyone hasn't yet responded to the poll. Yeah, nice to see that most people are currently doing stakeholder analysis, and some of you doing it in a very advanced and extensive way as well. Right. Okay, I'm going to stop that poll now. So let's look at, how do you actually approach stakeholder analysis? So there's generally 4 sort of steps to the process: identifying your stakeholders, doing an assessment of them, grouping them based on that assessment, and then a step that's often missed is regular review, and so repeating this whole process at regular intervals because it changes. So not only does our understanding of the stakeholders change as we progress through our work, but we should review it, and it should. One of the things I find that people are not doing often enough is monitoring how that some of those factors in the analysis change over time or over the course of your project. And really, that should be part of your evaluation metrics in many ways. There's a number of models that people traditionally use for stakeholder analysis. The most common is the salience model. So you might have seen this as a grid, a 4-way grid, where looking at power, legitimacy, and urgency. And then the grid that would be most common that you'd see if you search for stakeholder mapping, that's the one that comes up most often, is the keep informed, keep close, monitor closely, that sort of thing. There's various versions of it. You may not always use the terms power, legitimacy, urgency. Sometimes it's influence, power, or they all follow that same model. Sometimes we see a stakeholder knowledge-based chart where stakeholders are mapped on a quadrant based on their level of awareness, and then whether they support or oppose the work or project. That's a fairly sort of basic and rudimentary kind of approach, but we just do still see it quite commonly. Power interest grid is a version of the salience model. So again, it's mapping on a grid the stakeholders' level of power over your work and their level of interest in your work. And power predictability matrix, again, is similar to that knowledge-based chart, as seeking to influence. One of the big and common themes we see with a lot of these existing models is that my problem with them, I should say, is that I think they're very dated. A lot of them were developed in the 1970s and 80s. The world has really changed since then. The power dynamic has shifted. The organization running the stakeholder engagement no longer holds the power, really. It is much, social media, access to information. All of that has meant that that power kind of dynamic has changed a lot. And I think it's naive to think that, a stakeholder who has low power by traditional definitions and possibly low interest or low influence cannot affect your work or your project. I mean, we've seen the sort of network impacts of people power, the spread of misinformation or information, access to information can really shift it. So people who were traditionally thought as low influence, and were put into that quadrant that said keep informed, or no, basically do nothing almost, could actually be the ones that derail your project, right? If things go badly. So I think a lot of these models, don't reflect the current sort of political environment that we live in. And so it's a little bit dangerous to rely on this sort of approach. So I'm going to pause here and ask you what, and it's not a poll this time, I'm just going to ask you to add some notes in the chat about what sort of models you currently use when you're doing stakeholder mapping. And particularly interested to hear for, those of you who said you've been doing quite extensive stakeholder mapping. And, there's no, I'm not asking you to share your details with the view of trying to criticize it. I'm just curious to know what you are using now. So pop a note in the chat and let us know what sort of mapping model do you use. Is it the power and interest grid? Is it power legitimacy grid? I'll give you a couple of minutes because I'd really love to see you add some comments in here. Power and influence. Yeah, that's super common. I'd say that's probably the most common model that we see. Drew says, primarily the power interest grid, but we usually undertake key stakeholder interviews to better understand interests. Yeah, great. That's nice. Really nice. Mix of all of them, depending on the project. Yes. Power and interest grid as well. Yeah. Great. Another one for power interest. Antoinette says, using all 4 grids in an Excel spreadsheet. Yeah, way for a fresh and more efficient approach. Great, great. Hopefully we can give you some good ideas in the next session. The next section of this webinar. Awesome, thanks for sharing that. Keep adding your comments. We'll just keep going just in the interest of time. So the approach we take at Simply Stakeholders and Darzen is slightly different. We build on those models, obviously, but we've shifted our thinking a little bit on it as well. So we actually use 6 criteria in our stakeholder mapping. So initially, the top level here, the 3 I's, we have influence, interest, and impact. And I'll go through what these, how we define these categories in a minute. But the other 3 categories we use are criticality. So understanding, the thinking behind criticality is that with all of your stakeholders, wherever they fall on this interest, influence, impact scale, some of them are going to be really critical to your success. So identifying who they are, and this could be someone who's actually low influence, but they're just very well connected in the community, so they're critical. You get them, you get a whole bunch of other people, on side or in support. So identifying the critical stakeholders, then keeping track of their position in relation to your work on a scale from very negative to very positive. And one of the things that, we monitor is how is that changing over time? Are you shifting those positions for those critical stakeholders? And then the 6th criteria is effort. Understanding how much effort would be required to engage with some of these stakeholders. And that's almost kind of like a reality check sort of criteria of saying, yes, we have these critical stakeholders, we need to kind of engage or shift, but some of them might require a huge amount of effort compared to others. And it just provides another dimension in terms of how you look at it. So this is kind of currently what the way we look at stakeholder mapping. When we talk about influence, so the thing that most correlates with those power, effort is good parameter. Yeah, exactly. One of the things that most correlates with that power, interest, influence grid is what we call the 3 I's. When we're talking about influence, we're talking about the stakeholders' potential to influence your work or your project. Okay, so how influential are they? If you're a project that requires regulatory approval, for example, obviously someone in the government or the regulatory body has a high level of influence over your project. Okay, the concept of interest is the one that's most sort of misunderstood, I think, and this is why I wrote that blog post on it recently. I think often people think about interest as who's interested in my work, how interested are they in my work or my project? And really the concept of interest should be much broader. It should be thinking more I think you need to think about it as, who has a legitimate reason to have an interest, whether it's legal or cultural or political, who has a right to be consulted or involved in this process, right? So it's slightly different to how interesting is my project to this person. Well, very different to that. It's really talking about who has a legitimate, reason to be to be involved in it. Hope that sort of definition is clear. And then impact is, again, sometimes people think about it as who can impact my work, but really we like to define it as who is impacted by your work. If this policy that you're developing as a government agency, or service that you're delivering, or this renewable energy project, this wind farm you're putting up that has a wind turbine in on someone's property, who is actually impacted by that work? The person whose property the wind turbine is on, or the recipient of that government service, the person whose life is going to be impacted by the new policy that you're trying to implement, right? So who is your work impacting? So this is kind of the 3 I's are really the core for our stakeholder mapping module. And then we layer it on with the other 3, which is that criticality, position, and effort. And the advantage of having all of that connected in a system like ours is that it gives you lots of different ways to slice them through your data and view what's happening in there. So not only do you do the stakeholder mapping in terms of these 6 criteria, you also do a grouping exercise based on stakeholder functions. So example, are they government or business or an NGO? As well as interest. Are they an environmental group? Are they interested in, this is more, what is their kind of primary interests, I guess, or purpose for existing as a group. And so you do this whole stakeholder grouping exercise, you do the mapping exercise, and then they're all interconnected, which allows you to interrogate the data and say who in the contact group of unions or business is the most critical to our project or most influential, right? So having that cut through is really important as well for then developing those strategies in your engagement plan of how you're actually going to involve them in your process. You can do some of that in Excel, but it's more challenging, right? Because Excel tends to be quite two-dimensional, whereas the advantage of a database sort of structure system like Simply Stakeholders is that it's more three-dimensional. So now a preview of what is coming. So, the stakeholder mapping model I've just shown you and our approach to it's been super successful with a lot of our clients. But the next thing we're adding to this is network mapping. So we're creating some visual network maps, and there's going to be 3 levels to that. There's the organization chart. So when you look at a stakeholder, a business or a government department, what is the hierarchy within that organization, understanding, who reports to whom and where your relationship sits. Then looking at who else they're connected to within your own organization. One of the challenges a lot of our customers tell us is that they don't have visibility over who is interacting with the stakeholders, who else is talking to them. They can go to meet with the stakeholder only to find out that a different department in their council or the government department has just been talking to the same stakeholder about possibly the same topic or giving them slightly different information. So that lack of visibility over not only who our stakeholders are, but who's engaging with them is kind of a real pain point for a lot of our customers. So this visual chart is actually going to show who else within our organization is also engaging with the stakeholder. And then the third level is to understand the stakeholders' own networks. Who else are they connected to? So again, coming back to that idea of, the benefit, one of the benefits we're looking to get out of stakeholder analysis is how can we access certain groups or communities by leveraging the stakeholders' networks that they have. So that's a really exciting development. We're excited to release that soon, and I think that's going to kind of really help people get that visual kind of representation. We're also introducing things like sort of health scores and making it easier to see exactly what the health of your relationship is with the stakeholder. So look out for some information on that. We'll be kind of making some announcements on it. Drew's asking about data residency. Yes, we have servers in Canada. We use Microsoft Azure data centers, super secure, and we have servers in quite a few different parts of the world, including Canada, the US, Europe, Australia, etc. So, love to know your thoughts on this. I'm going to pause here for a minute and see what you think. It's what do you think of the approach we currently take, and where we're taking it next with this visual network mapping? Antoinette says, this network mapping is extremely useful. I include this function at present, and it makes a big difference to engagement processes and understanding the dynamics between different stakeholder groups. Exactly. That's kind of, I feel like that's the next frontier. It's not just our relationship with the stakeholder, but understanding their networks and their relationships with other stakeholder groups. Drew says, love this idea of network mapping, very critical in a large organization like ours. A lot of our big government clients or large complex organizations have been asking us about this, which is why we're sort of creating it. Awesome. Okay, so let's keep going. That's kind of largely the content I wanted to go through today. I thought I'd create some time for some questions and discussion about that approach. So the left hand knows what the right hand's doing. Exactly. I mean, it's so common now, right? I keep talking to organizations that say exactly that problem. We turn up for a meeting only to find out someone else has just met with them the day before. Any questions about this? Would you like some clearer explanations of some of the definitions or the approaches that I've outlined that we take? Is there anything you can take away from this and add to your approach with, if all of you who mentioned you're doing power interest kind of grids, how about just introducing even one more criteria to that, take it a step further? No questions or comments? Well, if you'd like to see how we do this in our software as well, reach out. I know the team will be in touch with you after the webinar if you've registered for it, and we'd love to show you how we do it. And when we haven't kind of released the new version as yet, but we can certainly put you on our list to invite you for when we do the announcement for it, if you'd like to see this network mapping. Thank you, Jafale. I think your presentation is good. Fresh perspective. Awesome. Oh, Antonio, that's interesting. Predicted behavior in your analysis. You look at stakeholders' predictive behavior. Yeah, controversial projects for sure. Awesome. Yeah. Well, we have got a bit of time, so I hadn't planned to do this, but what I could do, if I can remember how to share my screen and all of that, you'll have to give me 1 second and I'll see if I can log in to my account and give you a 5-minute overview of the tool as well. That wasn't part of the plan, but we have finished a little bit earlier than expected. So would that be of interest to you guys? Okay, I have got a few too many things open on my screen. Give me 1 minute and I will share my screen. Awesome. Okay. Slides, stop slide presentation. It might just take a minute to load. So I think I might not be sharing the right screen. Give me a minute. The perils of having 50 tabs open on your computer. If you've got any questions you want to ask me while I'm trying to figure out my technology, please do so. Here we go. Let's try this again. Okay, so what you're looking at is my sample database. You know, don't look for too much meaning in any of the data. Yeah, you can set up multiple projects and workspaces. Simply Stakeholders is, you know, really focused around tracking who your stakeholders are, tracking the interactions with them, and a really strong task management functionality. But let's dive into specifically, one of the other things we also do is we track issues and sentiment. So that's another layer, right? So if you think about the various layers to the information you're keeping on stakeholders, not only is it the grouping based on interest groups, it's the stakeholder mapping fields, and then sentiment and issues, right? And all of that allows you to slice through it. Here's the sort of influence, interest, and impact. So we use a scale from very low to very high. You're able to click into it at any time and pull out a list of, you know, who are our most influential stakeholders on this project. Then also being able to view. So one of the big challenges we find with organizations is that if they do the stakeholder mapping, they usually don't have a way to make use of that information in terms of monitoring how they're going on their program, tracking how things are changing, or even making sure they're talking to the right people at the right time, right? So that's why this is one of my favorite charts in the program. So it's looking at influence, interest, and impact again. But this time it's showing us how many of those high influence stakeholders did we actually engage with, right? 18, 45 we didn't engage with. We want to set some goals for us, our team, that we're going to have a touch point with everyone who's high influence once a month. Coming to the end of the month, we can easily see these are the ones we have engaged with, these are the ones we haven't engaged with. So we know exactly who we need to go and focus on in order to get this chart looking better. And look over here, we haven't talked to anyone who's highly impacted by this project. We've just been talking to the, you know, the high influence and the kind of low interest people, but none of the high impact people have been spoken to. So, you know, critical flaw. So that's one of the nice things about having a system is that it surfaces that information for you. Right, while you can do some of this stuff in spreadsheets and stuff, and I'm, you know, not even has a budget for a system, so totally understand. But one of the challenges you end up with is the information gets lost in your spreadsheet. Once you get more than 100 stakeholders, how do you actually surface, you know, that problem and see exactly what's missing? You can also view your data on a scattergram, and you can filter it by contact groups and things like that. But then when we get in, this chart is another one I wanted to show you. So this is that contact grouping that we talked about, you know, business, government, consultants, environmental groups. And again, it's showing you where you've been spending your efforts. So we've been talking to all the suppliers and businesses, but we haven't talked to any residents who live really close to our project. So again, you know, a bit of a problem. We need to go and address it. Right, so that's kind of like a a snapshot little view of some of what we do with stakeholder mapping. Any questions or comments? Oh, a question. The graph is based on values that were assigned by team. Yes. So the stakeholder mapping values are definitely entered by team members. And one of the important things as well is, like, if you're in a big organization like the government department, the same stakeholder could have different sort of values on those stakeholder mapping criteria for different projects or initiatives. And so it's project or initiative based, and you can also view it from a higher level and say, you know, what are all the things that my organization is doing with the stakeholder, and which, you know, of those initiatives or projects do they have most influence or most interest, or whatever the criteria you want to look at. So it is user based. The other thing that we do is we track exactly when it was changed and by which user. So some of our clients put into their workflow that when you're changing the stakeholder mapping value, you have to put a comment on the stakeholder note to explain why you've changed it, right? And then some of the charts we show how you're shifting, you know, position. It tracks how those kind of key criteria are shifting over time. So I'm going to try and open up something else to see if I can show you what that looks like. But yeah, it's all auditable, it's all traceable. And then if the team member who's making the change adds a note to it, you know, that kind of clarifies it. Often there'll also be quite specific definitions. So the bigger organizations tend to, and we help them develop this as part of the onboarding processes, define exactly what you mean, you know, by a high influence stakeholder. What does that look like, so that we're all operating from the same definitions, we get some consistency. Yeah, social media, we do have really nice integrations that you can easily pull in things from things like Twitter. We haven't connected it as an automated way of affecting. That's an interesting point though, Antoinette. We haven't kind of automated that based on their sort of activity levels on Twitter, for example, whether that impacts the influence score. But certainly you can pull in stuff from things like Twitter. You can run that, you know, AI-driven sentiment analysis on it, so you can get a sentiment score. And in the new version where we're bringing in those sort of relationship health scores and sentiment scores, that will automatically calculate and display it. Drew asks, can you manage campaigns from within the program? Yes. So group mail, which I didn't mention, is a function to, you know, it's like an outreach tool. You can send out emails and newsletters, things like that. Tagomo says, in the context of environmental and social impact assessment, which chart can you propose? All of them sometimes, to be quite honest. I'm trying to think. I personally like the multi-factor analysis. I find if you rely on just one thing, you know, it's really easy to miss it. That's why, you know, for me, even that criticality criteria, sometimes it might feel like it's, well, we've already identified the high influence stakeholders or the high impact stakeholders. Aren't they the most critical ones? Well, you know, not necessarily, because sometimes, depending on the project, particularly if it's controversial or maybe it's in a very rural area, being able to identify, you know, sometimes the critical stakeholders are not who you think they are. And just having that additional criteria for your team to be able to record it as they sort of encounter and discover it is quite interesting, right? Okay, so one of the other things I'm going to show you, give me 1 second and I'll share my screen. Okay. So one of the other charts I want to show you, scrolling down, is this one, how we deal with position and criticality and effort versus criticality, right? So the idea, and you can filter it, see, by influence, interest, impact, the 3 I's. So being able to understand, you could say for my high influence stakeholders, how many of these critical stakeholders do I have? So filter it by any of those criteria. But really what we're trying to do here is we're saying, okay, we're actually trying to shift everyone into this green zone. So our first priority is these 2 stakeholders who are critical and currently very negative about our work. Then we're going to focus on these 4. So it gives you a very targeted information. So this database, for example, might have, thousands of stakeholders, but we know where we need to focus most of our efforts right now to try and shift the dial, right? And then one of the reports shows how that's shifting over time, so you can track to see whether you're actually making a difference or not. Make sense? Awesome. Well, thank you for bearing with me while I did an impromptu little demo of our product. Really great to have all your input and feedback. Please stay in touch if you'd like to get to know more about our software or even our approach. We're always willing to share our knowledge and experience in this industry. So please, stay in touch with us. And we run webinars once a month at this stage. And so, keep an eye out for future webinars or content we're putting on our website. And get in touch if you'd like a demo or if you've got any questions. Great. And if you found it useful, let us know so we can, or other topics that you're interested in, please let us know. We're happy to kind of set up new webinars on them. Awesome. I'm so glad you guys found some value in this. Makes my day. So thank you, and lovely to see some familiar names and faces again. And until the next time. Bye.